Hello, everyone.
Everyone can hear you now.
It's so lovely to meet you, SpongeBob. So we're here. I'm Miranda Sawyer. This is a Guardian Live. I'm here to interview SpongeBob. Hi, SpongeBob.
SpongeBob's gone away. He'll be back if there's a problem. SpongeBob is here for emotional reassurance, and so if you see SpongeBob, it means that there's been a problem.
Okay, well, it's good to know. Anyway, welcome, Adam. How are you?
Thank you.
In your what looks like, is that your podcast studio?
Yes, exactly. This is my nutty room where I do my recording of jingles, adverts, audiobooks, etc.
Etc. etc. I feel that we should start talking initially about your book, your Ramble Book, which was a proper book that you sat down and wrote, but then became something different, an audiobook, out before the actual book, which is coming. So obviously, I don't know how many people have listened to it, but I would assume some and not all. I have listened to it. I want to know, you decided that you were going to do the audiobook, and you decided, like, just at the beginning of lockdown, and you'd spent ages writing the book, and you decided to do the audiobook. Was that fun or hard work? And also, it's very different from a written book. I mean, you've got stupid voices in it and everything.
Yeah, it was fun. That was back in the old days when the lockdown was fun. I'm being ironical. The lockdown was never fun, and obviously it was indicative of the fact that a lot of people were having no fun whatsoever. But for some of the lucky ones like myself, it was a kind of an interesting change of pace. The weather was nice. I got to spend more time with my family. Wow, this is weird. Maybe this is how life should be, I was thinking for a while. And to keep me focused work-wise, I had the project of recording the audiobook. As you say, I did it because I thought, well, I know that I was really keen to listen to stuff myself. I was downloading a lot of audiobooks, and I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to do mine and to put that out there as well. And also, as you say, I'd spent ages writing the actual book. I started technically sort of trying to write it in about 2016, but didn't really start in earnest until the beginning of last year. But it has taken a really ridiculously long time. And so I was keen to get it out.
They're so hard to write.
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean, you'll realize over the course of this conversation that, I'm talking off the cuff is not my strong suit. I have to really think hard to formulate proper sentences. So it took me ages and ages. I was averaging about a sentence a day for the best part of 3 years or something. The book was supposed to come out 2 years ago, literally. So I missed 4 deadlines altogether. But in the end, I started doing the audiobook. The publisher said, yeah, okay, let's do the audiobook before the hardback comes out. It's never been done before, but we'll try it. And it was good fun because I wrote it to be spoken, really. I always had the audiobook in mind. I always felt, well, that's kind of my medium if I have one, really. I feel comfortable in the audio medium more than any other one. And so as I was writing it, I would read it aloud to myself. And also I interviewed the writer David Sedaris, and he inspired me to go out and do work in progress shows the way a stand-up comedian would, and read what I'd been writing to a live audience, a small audience, and get a sense of how it sounded. And it becomes very apparent very quickly when you have human beings in front of you, what's working and what's not, what's boring. And I mean, it's slightly...
And which bits did you discover were boring? So which are the bits that you cut out because of that?
Well, actually, some of the Adam and Joe stuff came out because that was boring. Weirdly, you would think, me and Joe being such great, fun guys, with such brilliant comedy work in our locker, you would think that's got to be the best stuff, surely. Turns out, no. Writing about an entertaining partnership, assuming you do think it's an entertaining partnership, turns out to be not. I mean, it turns out to be very hard to make it funny. Actually, it's easier, it seems, to be funnier about things that you might not think would be funny, about disasters and heartbreak and sadness. It's easier, or at least it was for me, to try and find the humor in those things rather than, making a TV show with Joe. So yeah, a lot of those. Yeah, exactly. That's the stuff when you start writing about your career specifically, or at least when I tried to, it very quickly becomes, and then we did that, and then we did this, and then we did that, and it's sort of boring.
Yeah. And with the audiobook, one of the things I really enjoyed about it is the different voices. So obviously the David Bowie voice is incredibly common throughout the whole thing. And I kind of felt like, well, if I read it now, it won't be as fun because the audiobook was kind of funner.
Well, screw you!
Maybe I've done it out of it. The other thing I would say, as somebody who's written books and crashed loads of deadlines in their time, is that books take ages. So you write the bloody thing, and then they go, great, it's going to be out in 9 months' time. And you're like, what do you mean 9 months' time? Like, surely you can just whack it out. Now, this is like, so to actually fill that time with an audiobook is great because you're filling the time where you feel like it should be out anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to leave that screw you hanging in the air like that because I think that would be weird.
All right, I'm a big girl, I can take it.
So let's just unpack that. It wasn't real. And also, I'm hoping that people will buy the hardback because it's a different thing and it has had a great deal of visual effort put into it, not only by, I've got a brilliant artist called Helen Green who does the artwork for my podcast, and she has done so many really, really excellent illustrations that go throughout the book. So it's a sort of lovely looking thing, and we've tried to make it as visually interesting as possible. There's also great photographs in there. Don't forget the plate section, Miranda. Everyone loves the plate section. I love
that bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's that.
It's gonna be good.
And also, I suppose for the people that listen to the podcast and are familiar with my stuff anyway, hopefully they'll be able to hear my voice and they'll be able to hear the voices, because most of them I sort of do anyway on the podcast one way or another. And I don't know what it'll be like for people who pick it up or get given it, who've never heard of me. I mean, yeah.
But you can't worry about them, can you?
No. Screw them!
Okay, so look, let's talk about some of the stuff that's in the book, and then we've got questions that have been sent in, and you can do, if you're watching, if you click on the thing that says Q&A, you can send questions also, and I will ask some of them. But I wanted to, I suppose, talk to you a little bit about when you were younger, because you write about going to boarding school, and there are some bits in that I found incredibly upsetting, I have to say. So there's a bit where you talk about you're phoning home and you are talking to your mum, and this is literally what you say, which I wrote it down. I found it very upsetting. I crouched behind the glass panels in the door, so no one in the dinner queue could see me, and sobbed my 9-year-old tits off. So obviously funny, sobbing tits off. Not funny at all, 9-year-old crying for his mum.
I know, it's sad.
And it's terribly sad. And then you also, your parents did, as you explain in the book, they did absolutely the best for you as they felt. But those parts are very, they're upsetting. I mean, was it, when you wrote them, how was it writing that stuff? Because it is very difficult, a 9-year-old away from the parents.
Well, I was thinking about what it would be like if that was my 9-year-old. I have 3 children, and the youngest is 11 now, and she's just a little girl. I mean, I couldn't bear being away from her for a long time. And the idea of her as an 11-year-old calling me up crying is very painful to contemplate. The idea of her as a 9-year-old, I mean, when she was 9, she's just a tiny person. And so that is hard. And I say in the book, I asked my mum not so long ago, while I was writing the book, I said to her, wasn't it weird? Because I was remembering this stuff. One of the things you do in the course of writing a book like this is just go into your memory rabbit hole. Sometimes I read other people's books and I think, how can they remember this stuff? They must have just made a lot of this up. Like Steve Coogan's book I read, for example. And there's an incredible level of detail in there that I just thought, well, that can't be real. Because how can he possibly remember like what people were wearing and what they said? But it turns out that it is doable. It's a form of self-hypnosis, perhaps, that for me was facilitated by listening to music. I went back and looked at the charts for a given month in 1982 or whatever. And because they were so important to me, like the top 40, I knew everything in the top 40 right through the 80s. So looking at the top 40 unlocked everything. Memories of smells, what I was wearing, who I was with, what kind of conversations we had, how I felt, all these things flooded back. And I used photographs and diaries and videos and all these aids to remembering this stuff. And these really intense feelings came back. And so I asked my mum, like, what was that like, having your 9-year-old son who you loved calling you up in tears from this place that you'd sent him away to and you weren't going to see him again for a few months, And she said, well, do you know, I've never really thought about it. And which was sort of, I think, just the way my mum dealt with it, like just to not think about it. I think there's a certain type of person for whom that's a kind of viable philosophy. Don't concentrate on upsetting things. Don't think about stuff that makes you unhappy or that is difficult. I mean, to us, that seems manifestly short-sighted because those things will come back and bite you in the arse at some point if you don't deal with them. But my mum really was an adherent of that philosophy of like, don't think about it. If it's sad and upsetting, if you don't think about it, then you won't be sad and upset. Job done.
Yeah, it's amazing that you unpick very brilliantly the differences between your parents' generation and you, but particularly between you and your dad, and what that. I mean, you write very. I mean, some of it's really funny, and some of it's very moving about the differences between the approach of you and your dad, and what he would have liked and what he wanted, and how things did not, nothing ever happens in the way that you imagine. But the reason why he sent you to boarding school is because he wanted you to have opportunities that he felt, were maybe denied to him when he was younger. I mean, it's always the same, isn't it, really? So if you're not sending your kids to boarding school, it's because you're trying to not do what was done to you. And it's the same for him, isn't it? It's the same. It's he's trying to he is trying to make your life better than his.
Yeah, exactly. Or at least replicate the parts of his life that he felt were most worthwhile. My dad had it in his head that to be part of the establishment was the best thing, and that would insulate you from all sorts of problems. And also he admired the British establishment. His family, his mum and dad, were servants in a kind of posh house. And so I think they had that strange upstairs, downstairs relationship that kind of Downton Abbey relationship that people in those days had with their employers. And they kind of, I don't know if all of them felt this way, but I think my grandparents did. They admired and respected the people they worked for, and they were grateful to be under their, under their employ and in their care. They felt looked after by their employers, by the upper classes, and they aspired to that life themselves. They were surrounded by by this different way of life, by an upper class way of life. And they sort of thought, well, if we can somehow get our children into that world, then great. And so my dad went off to a grammar school, and then ended up in a public school called the ISC, the Imperial Service College, which later became Haileybury. And that was all thanks to the patronage of the people that my grandparents were employed by, and the kind of the army network as well of the person that my grandfather served. He was a batman for this lieutenant colonel in the First World War, and after the lieutenant colonel was killed, then the family took care of my grandparents and of their children as well. Anyway, so my dad had it in his head that was the best thing to aspire to be part of all that was good about the British establishment. And so that's what he wanted for us. Hence all the private schools and the boarding school.
And the boarding school, and actually in the end, the kind of angst about money, because in those situations, that what you actually need in order to be part of the establishment is a shitload of money, really.
Yeah,
it's quite hard to do it if you don't have the right financial backings. And your dad found it hard to keep the money kind of maintained. There's an absolutely brilliant moment where you mentioned towards the end of the book that you had gone to New York with your family, and your dad becomes convinced that. Do you want to tell the story? Because I can't quite believe it happened. He becomes convinced that something's wrong at home. What does he do? He gets on to Concorde.
Oh, yeah.
I just can't believe this story. It's unbelievable.
I know. It really, it speaks of a different time in every conceivable way, doesn't it? So it would have been early 80s, I suppose. My dad was a travel journalist. He was the editor of the Sunday Telegraph's travel section. And so from about the mid 60s, early 60s through to the late 80s, he traveled everywhere, and he had all the privileges that came with being, a powerful travel journalist. And we went off to New York as a family, and he was writing about the trip. But when we got there, he suddenly remembered, he reckoned, that he'd left the safe unlocked in our house in Earl's Court. And he had this big old safe where he had some very expensive cameras, Leica cameras and things like that. And, like a silver candelabra, and all the valuables were in the safe. And he reckoned that he'd left it open. So he got on Concorde and he went back to London, took a taxi from Heathrow back to Earl's Court, locked the safe, taxi back to Heathrow, got the next Concorde flight, and he was back the same day in New York. And I mean, we just thought, wow, this guy's a superhero. He can do anything. And I forgot about that. And then when I was writing the book, I remembered that he'd done that. And I just thought, that is absolutely insane on every conceivable level.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, there's something so admirable about it and so ridiculously appalling about it for somebody who is worried about money as well. It's just completely mad. It is. He
wouldn't have paid for the flight, I don't think.
Oh, well, then that's fine. Then I would have done the same, just for a laugh. Just got on Concorde and come back the next day.
I mean, I think he would have wangled the flight, but yeah, just from the point of view of like a snapshot of a world where no one was even beginning to think about like how wasteful that would be, the damage that would do to the environment, and all that kind
you
of
could just
thing.
phone someone up and say, "Can you just check if the safe is open?" Maybe.
Yeah.
You've done any of those things. You talk about your school days, and as you get older, you go to school in Westminster and you meet Joe Cornish, the Cornballs, and you meet Louis Theroux, and you all become friends. There's an extended kind of crew of you, and you write very touchingly and funnily about about the various parties you go into and your various insecurities around having such clever friends. And one of the things that I wondered about was that you're all very close, you're all very friendly, but there seems to be a slight divide, and I think the divide is this: booze and weed.
Right.
And you started off as a boozer. I would say, I hope I'm incorrect in this, that Joe and Louis were more on the stoner side, and that can be quite, it's almost like a divide when you're younger, isn't it? Because you're looking for different thrills.
Yeah, that's interesting. You picked up on that. I suppose maybe I suppose that's obvious to people, isn't it? Because that is definitely a thing, depending on what your poison is, or, maybe you're someone that never drank and never did drugs or anything. That also sets you apart in your own way. But yeah, it really was a bit of a schism between myself and Joe and Louis and the others, because they were all stoners fairly early on. And I really wasn't. I really thought, no, that's bad. I think I was frightened of it. And my parents always used to go on about how disastrous drugs were, but, they loved boozing. So it never even crossed my mind that boozing might be bad for you. So I was happy to do that. And there was frequently a divide between boozy Buxton and cool, chilled out, doobie smoking Cornballs and Louis Theroux listening to groovy music. Because that was the other thing. I think it affects so much, doesn't it? Like, it affected the kind of, I was sort of listening to angsty art pop. I listened to Bowie, obviously, and things like that. But I always had a affinity for, punk and new wave and kind of uptight white guy music. And booze kind of went with that, Whereas they were smoking and they were listening to much more kind of chilled out, a lot more sort of jazz and soul and hip hop and that kind of thing, which they were really appreciating. And Joe, I remember Joe would kind of get baked. I hope he's not watching this. And he would kind of get all blissed out, and he'd start doing all this like with his eyes closed, and he was kind of, and his hands would start going, and he was like feeling the music. The music was going through, and I was just sat there with my can of lager going, "Are we allowed to swear?" F off.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because when you're young, there's definitely those kind of weird divides, and you write about them really brilliantly, and all the different kinds of tribes that you have when you're younger. And then as you get older, the school you went to was pretty academic, let's say, and your friends went off to university, they went to film school, and there's a very interesting part, I think, where you don't go, where you work in a restaurant. And then eventually you end up going to art school. But I think that part of you working in a restaurant is actually incredibly important, because when you eventually do go to university, you realise it isn't for you. You come off the rails that are laid out for you at that point. And that's quite important, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I really did my best to be on the rails. And obviously my dad had all his hopes pinned to the Westminster Oxbridge sausage factory working as planned. The idea was, you pay top dollar, you send your child to this school, and there's a good chance they're going to get them into Oxford or Cambridge, and then off you go, you're part of the establishment, you can do what you want. And so that's what my dad was really hoping was going to happen. And when it became clear, as I started gradually going off the rails, not spectacularly, but screwing up fairly badly and doing plays with Joe and making films and titting about and having a good time and drinking lager and going to the movies and really not knuckling down. He got worried, and then when it all just fell apart, I just didn't get the grades. There was no way that I was going to go to Oxbridge or anything like that. And I think he took it on the chin, actually, my dad. He was nice about it. My mum was very upset because eventually I got into Warwick to do English literature. So my dad was happy about that, at least. It was like, okay, that's, there's still a chance that he might make something of himself. But then, as you say, by the time I eventually got in, because I had to resit some exams, I'd been out for 2 years and I'd been working in a restaurant and I'd met nice people who didn't go to public school. And because that's the thing, is like, there's a great variety of people within the school, wherever you are, but it's still, broadly speaking, a type of person. And there's a lot of very similar backgrounds of people there. Not all, there's a diversity, but then when you go and you get a job where all sorts of people from all over the world and, a far more diverse group of people you're suddenly exposed to, it's like, wow, this is way better. This is really fun. And also I was young and it was just so enjoyable. I had such a good time working with those people that the idea of going back into higher education and being back with another lot of people who were all more or less the same age and a lot of them from the same kinds of backgrounds, it just wasn't nearly as interesting.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And you shifted. There's some people on the Q&A asking about the stuff behind you. So I feel like you should give us a slightly guided tour. So we can see an album on the keyboard. What's that? Do you want to show it us?
Oh, that's I got this.
Michael Lilly has asked about that.
Well, that's an album by Buddy Hackett, and this is a present from Tim Key, because I did some work with Tim Key and Alex Horn earlier this year for an ongoing project of theirs, which may well never see the light of day. So I probably shouldn't say too much about it. But as a thank you for my contribution, Tim sent me this record, and he also sent me this one by Buddy Hackett, because we stayed at a house together, me and Alex and Tim. And the house, it was an Airbnb in New York, in fact, and it was owned by some guy who ran a cool bookshop, record shop place in Sugar Hill in New York. And it was so groovy. And every morning we would put on these amazing jazz records and have breakfast and look through the books on the shelves. And one of them was a book of poetry by Buddy Hackett, who was a kind of old school American comedian. And I think I might be totally off beam, but I get the feeling that Buddy Hackett was, who would be the British equivalent? I don't know, like
John Cooper Clarke. That's a joke.
Definitely not John Cooper Clarke. Benny Hill, but not even, but someone very mainstream and comedic. But Buddy Hackett had written this book of poems that were trying to be deep and profound about the same thing, about life. And some of them were quite good in a weird way, and some of them were just very bad. Anyway, me and Tim Key and Alex Horn would read those poems to each other at breakfast. And so that was a nice present from Tim to commemorate that. What else is there? Some of these things, I have to confess, I have brought in here for this link.
Are they decoration?
They're decorations.
Come on, let's have a look at them.
These are all my
dad's... Are they your clever books?
No, these are my dad's self-published books. Actually, amazing. No, one of them was actually legitimately published. Walks in Wine Country. My dad loved wine and was an expert, and he took all the photographs in this book and all his
brilliant.
His ambitions for becoming a successful author and making lots of money and solving all his financial problems were pinned to the publication of this book towards the beginning of the 90s, but unfortunately it didn't happen, didn't sell. But then all the self-published ones, which I mentioned in my book, this was his book, The Proving Ground, which was a novel all about this is a novel about a man. So my dad wrote this when he was in his 60s and he was in extreme financial difficulties and he was having scary meetings with his bank manager. And so the book that my dad wrote at that point was about a man who is in his 60s and is going through extreme financial difficulties and is having scary meetings with his bank manager and is sending his children to private school and he can't afford it. So he goes to Alaska and he finds some gold. And all his problems. I mean,
it's like the definition of wishful thinking, isn't it?
Yeah. My dad loved Alaska, so he spent a lot of time writing about Alaska, traveling out there and finding out about the kind of gold rush culture there and everything. So, it was very thoroughly researched and it's well written and everything, but it was so transparently this wish fulfillment exercise that it was quite weird. And then these are his two, like version 1 of his self-published autobiography, The Fading Margin, and version 2, The Road to Fleet Street. And so in here he writes about, being in going to the ISC, and he doesn't write about his parents much. Like he doesn't delve into that whole kind of class angst and the chip on his shoulder, which he definitely had. And that was obviously the stuff that I really wished that I'd been able to wheedle out of him, but he never wanted to talk about it really. Anyway, but there's lots of interesting stuff, and this sort of combines, like the first half is his autobiography, the interesting parts, i.e., once he got into the British establishment, and then it sort of ends when he had a family. It's like, oh no, that's boring.
Yeah, my life's over now. Sorry.
Exactly, yeah. And then the second half is all his travel pieces.
And you mentioned that I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to ask a few questions that we've got that are popping up. But at the end, your dad, is that your dad there?
That's him that's him when he joined the army.
That's bad dad when he's not bad.
Yeah. Look at the pouting going on there.
He's so good looking, isn't he? It's amazing.
It's like he knows where the light band, is. Not the army. And then that was him. That's the bad dad we know. Oops.
Yeah, there he is.
With me and Joe.
What are you wearing, Adam?
We are dressed up as subversive. We called ourselves what did we call ourselves? The lame pranksters. And we would sort of, it was us trying to do kind of rip-offs of things that Mark Thomas would do, and Michael Moore and those kinds of things. It was like we were trying to do our version of that, but badly.
Boys, there's your dad comes to live with you just before he dies, and it's quite a tricky time. And one of the themes in your book that you come back to is that essentially life, when you think it's about to be like a film, it's never like a film. It's never. There are points in your career, even when you're at school, when there's, in a normal film, it should be, this is the point where the hero takes over and wins, and it never happens. And when your dad comes to stay with you, in his final few months, what you were hoping, which is all people always hope for, is a kind of revelatory chat and a straightening, a sorting out of things. And that doesn't happen. But you write very movingly about his last few days, and he literally has an identity crisis, doesn't he?
Yeah, so he had cancer, and cancer of the lining of the lung, and he wasn't in a great deal of pain, I'm glad to say, but he managed the pain that there was with morphine, Oromorph. But people who have taken that, either some form of morphine recreationally, or if they've been using it as pain management, maybe they'll be able to relate to the thing that sometimes happens, which is you go into a sort of fugue. I think it's called a fugue state, and you have a sort of break from your sense of self, or your sense of self gets muddled. And he had that one night. He woke up and he didn't know who he was. His sense of who he was had become separated from his internal monologue, or I don't know. It's hard to describe, but when it happened, I sort of knew what it was because I'd had the same thing the one time that I took magic mushrooms at university. I had the same thing. I looked in the mirror and I was like, "Who's that guy?" I felt that that kind of umbilical link had been severed, and it was really scary. I found it very frightening. I think some people, when they take drugs, that's all part of the fun, and they go on an adventure, and it's like, wow, this is an amazing new perspective on the world. But for me, it was like, oh my God, who's that? I don't know who that is. It was frightening. So frightening. Well, and in that moment, because he'd never taken drugs recreationally. When they were in the army, they gave them uppers.
Yeah, they used to give them speed, didn't they?
Yeah. But he'd never taken anything kind of mind-bending in that way. So that feeling was new to him. He'd never had that sort of bad trip moment. And what it meant to him was a sense of irrelevance, is how he described it. A revelation that nothing really matters. No one, if you were to disappear tomorrow, everyone would carry on. Everything would carry on. None of it really, really matters at the end of the day. And that's sort of a thing that maybe is quite liberating for some people when they take drugs, because it can be a liberating revelation. But then I think for another type of personality, that's absolutely disastrous and it's crushing. It's like, holy shit, well, I just spent 91 years fucking breaking my balls to try and get my children through school and write my autobiography, write 2 versions of my autobiography. All your efforts and all the things that you struggled so hard and all the sacrifices you made, in that moment, you're like, oh shit, none of it matters. What does that mean? And so I write in the book about what that meant to him and how that played out. And it was very unsettling, obviously, for him, but also for me to see my dad that vulnerable, and in a weird way, I'm glad I was with him because I was able to calm him down a little bit, or just sit with him until he was through it, and we just dunked hobnobs and then ended up watching Air Force One with Harrison Ford.
Always good. There is an element of that is very interesting if you are, I went on your podcast show and we talked about midlife crisis, and a lot of midlife crisis is around that sense of relevance. It's like, okay, I'm young, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, and it's going to be a success, or it's not going to be a success, or you might define yourself through your work. And I think in middle age, there's a point where you think, actually, I'm not relevant and maybe I shouldn't be chasing it. And I suppose I wanted to look at that big thing around your dad because it's a very moving part, but also because the reason why you started your podcast, or the reason why you're writing your audiobook, was there's a point in your career where Joe decided he was going to make films. You hadn't got Adam and Joe going on in Six Music, and you had to go, oh, well, I don't really know now. Am I relevant? What am I doing? Joe's going to do this. What am I going to do? And that step that you made into the podcast world is actually opened loads of doors for you, hasn't it?
Yeah, I suppose.
And you made it. You made it when you were feeling not so confident.
Yeah, I made it in my moment of irrelevance. I mean, that the thing is, obviously, if you pull back on any person's life, there's a point where even the most relevant person becomes totally irrelevant. And for someone in my position, you don't have to pull back that far. And and you do just think, oh, right, I'm a silly person. And, what have I achieved? And, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do. And so, yeah, for me, the podcast was very comforting and enjoyable because it meant that I could, even though my face is on the cover, as it were, really it's about the people that I'm talking to, and I get to kind of hang on their coattails and define myself by the conversations I have with them. And so that's been really good fun. And yeah, I'm sure that I wouldn't have got the opportunity to write the book were it not for the podcast. And the book enabled me to sort of find another niche, I suppose, which was to just forensically go through certain aspects of my life, which I've always done that to a degree. Like my material, such as it is, has always just been picking apart details of my own life and my responses to pop culture. Probably more when we were doing stuff, me and Joe, we were concentrating on that stuff. But now, increasingly, it's more just a kind of forensic navel gazing exercise.
But also, one learns from those things. So, shall I ask you a few questions, because people are firing
Sure.
them in, and I feel like I should do them. Okay, so these are about your interview style, actually.
Oh.
And there's two people, Jim and Christopher, have both said that they love your ramble chat approach to interviewing. It's like a real conversation. And did you set out to do that? And Christopher asks you, has your interview style changed and evolved? Have you consciously honed it? I mean, what were you trying to do? The Ramble Chat podcast.
I mean, I don't think I was trying to do anything. I suppose I was trying to capture the natural flow of a real conversation that you would have with a friend or a person that you'd met at a party or something. And, if you like that person or you're interested in that person, those conversations are great. That's what it's all about. But I don't go to too many parties anymore, and I don't really meet that many new people. And so the podcast is my only way of doing that. And so it feels to me, I want to form a relationship with that person, because it's valuable connection time for me. I don't want to go in there just as a journalist and ask questions about them, which they respond to. And, I selfishly, egotistically, you could say, I want to be part of the process. And so I'm trying to form a relationship with them. I've got no illusions about it carrying on beyond the podcast. It's not like I'm hanging out with all the people I've talked to on the podcast. But in that moment, for those 2 hours, it usually is, or hour and a half or whatever, I want to get to know them and have fun. And you'll know, obviously, having interviewed people for a long time, that, it's tricky. Asking questions is quite formal, isn't it? Like, I mean, you don't want to insert yourself too much into a real interview, because if the person's come along and expected to be interviewed in a formal way, they're going to go, why are you going on about yourself? Why are you telling me all about your dad or whatever? I thought this interview was about me. But now I've kind of established a situation, I hope, with most of the people I interview or talk to, where they know that it's not that kind of thing, and it'll be an exchange of views. But there are some people who I'm really interested in, but I've got no illusions about how interested they are in me, i.e. they're probably not. So people like Malcolm Gladwell or Michael Lewis, or people like that, whose books I've read and I really am interested in, but it would be too much of a waste of their time trying to establish a friendly rapport. And so I then I try and get a bit formal, and then I do my best to go into sort of proper interviewer mode. Write questions beforehand.
It's interesting because in here, there's another question here. This is from Dylan, and he says that although your podcast is mostly comedy world people, you like the podcast with your more serious guests, and says, do you prepare for these interviews any differently? Because they're grown ups. Do you prepare differently? Well, you do. You write the questions down.
Yeah. If the more intimidated I am by the person, the more I prepare. And I just feel as if, like, I don't want to get caught out being totally ignorant. But then sometimes, that's not to say that you can't go off on tangents. And if it becomes clear that the person is very relaxed and chatty, then great. I don't need the questions. The questions are there just as a backup. Like Philip Pullman turned out to be quite happy to go off on a few tangents, but I was really glad that I had prepared and I had got a few proper questions that I could fall back on. And Billy Connolly, that was another one. So I prepared quite a lot.
Yeah.
I got the opportunity to talk to him, but I didn't know all that much about him. I wasn't like mega fan, So I just did 2 weeks of intensive cramming and wrote a lot of questions. But in the end, actually, I didn't need them really, because he was so happy to talk.
That's a lovely podcast. That one's lovely. A really great one.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, very good. This is two people have asked you the same question. I'm going to ask you again. It's about the podcast. Hannah and Daniel both want to know, if you could interview David Bowie for the podcast, what one question would you ask him? So,
wow.
What's your Bowie question?
What's my David question? I would say, actually, full disclosure, Miranda and I talked about this before we went on air. And I was saying, God, I've got no idea. Where would I start? One question that occurs to me, one thing that I felt that I could see in him, but maybe it was just me projecting, was a certain degree of insecurity, artistic insecurity. Like, on the one hand, he seemed to be this fearless artist who would wade out into uncharted waters and maybe get out of his depth and maybe humiliate himself and produce something that really nobody liked very much, but who cares, because he's a real artist. And on the other hand, he wanted to be liked. He wanted to do well. He said in one quote, I always wanted to be thought of as a trendy person. I mean, how most people would never say something like that, something so transparently eager to please or be liked, but that's what he was like. He said that he got into music in the 60s because to him it looked as if pop stars were the ones that got all the fame, and fame was what he was interested in more than being a great musician at that point. You know what I mean? Later that changed, but originally, and he was completely upfront about it, he wanted to be liked and he wanted to be a famous trendy person. And so I always wondered what it was like for him when things didn't work. And clearly he spoke about how gutted he was when things like Low, the album he made in the late 70s, was a flop, really. Or at least the record label certainly thought it was not what they wanted. It was too weird and experimental. And Bowie was always gutted about that. Now, of course, everyone recognizes that it's one of his best records. But then later on, when I was into him, when I was discovering him throughout the 80s, like I got into him in 1980 when Scary Monsters came out. That was the first thing I'd heard. And I was like, oh, wow, this is very good. Yeah. And then for the next 4 years, I just went through all the 70s albums, not in order, but just explored all those. And it was just like, yeah, they're all great. Initially, it was always like, I'm not sure about this one. This isn't as good as Hunky Dory. But then I'd fall in love with them. But then the new stuff he was putting out in the 80s wasn't, to my mind, that good. Even Let's Dance, which is, a pretty great album. Yeah. But it wasn't what I wanted from Bowie. And then Tonight, Never Let Me Down, the more, cheesy, mainstream wannabe popular records that were kind of trying to keep him as popular as he had been with Let's Dance, they were just indefensible dog shit. And so
what would you, but Adam, what would you ask him?
What would I ask him? Sorry, that was a long monologue without a question. I would ask him how gutted was he that those things didn't work and that people just. I remember in 1995 there was a program called The Ozone, hosted by Jamie Theakston and Jane Middlemiss, and they did a whole Bowie special because he had a new album coming out, Outside, and it was sort of on the fence about, like, is Bowie, like, yeah, Bowie used to be great, but now he's a bit crap, isn't he? And they had people like Damon Albarn, I remember, saying, yeah, you know, we all love Bowie, but now, I mean, he's not really relevant, is he? There's that word again. And I think that must have been really hard. And I would like to know, like, honestly, how did he navigate that? And what was it? Did he ever achieve irrelevance enlightenment? Was he able to get beyond that? Because his career was so perfect in a way, because he ended up being 100% relevant, and he tied everything up so neatly. And one way or another, I mean, I wonder if he did that deliberately. Was he consciously thinking about it, or had he just moved beyond worrying about all that? And so it came together organically. That was, and then after I'd said all that, he'd go, "Is there a question at the end of this?" And then he'd get rid of me.
Okay, look, we've got a couple of questions here about, hang on, I'm moving my Google Docs up and down. Okay, about the jingles. Okay, so the jingles, which are lovely in your podcast and the radio shows, and also actually in your audio book. We've got a question here from Kate that says, the jingles from your radio shows and podcasts are some of the things that have made me belly laugh the most in my entire life. What is your development process for creating these little miracles? And another person, Annie, says, what's your favourite podcast jingle? And hang on. There's another one I saw. Oscar also loves your jingles, and he wants to know, are they still self-produced on GarageBand? Still.
Okay, well, let's see.
So are they still self-produced on GarageBand?
Not GarageBand, but Logic Pro, which is GarageBand with bells and whistles on.
Yeah, posh.
And
okay, what's your favourite one?
Favourite one, I like, we're halfway through the podcast. I think it's going really great. And because part of the reason I like that one is that I got a compliment. This is a name drop opportunity. Great. I got a compliment from Ed O'Brien, who plays guitar in Radiohead, and he said, yeah, that's great jingle. You got some lovely harmonies going on in that jingle. I was really impressed. And I was like, that's my favorite now. But
what about this one? What's your development process for them? I mean, I might be wrong about this, but do you kind of think, okay, I'm going to imitate this style, and this will come out?
No, it's a combination of just loops on GarageBand and Logic Pro. You know, slam a few loops together, and then just sort of sing some melodies over the top, and then just try and think of something to actually sing about, usually making toast or making tea or something in the kitchen. For some reason, that seems to be, I think, Weird Al Yankovic, not that I'm comparing myself to the great Weird Al, but he did a lot of songs about food. I think that's just something you do if you're either silly or you're just not, you don't have access to real feelings. And like, I'm in awe of songwriters that can write about serious songs about love or about, social themes. And
but it's also maybe because you don't get out of the house much.
Don't get out of the house much. Also, it's universal. Everyone can relate to going to the toilet and being in the kitchen. And so that's why it's quite a useful way of starting with a song. That's why I suppose Paul McCartney famously, when he was writing Yesterday, before he'd written any of those lyrics, it started off as scrambled eggs. Okay. And so my process will be, and often I use my omnichord, anything because I'm not I don't play music. I'm not a good musician. So this kind of machine is good because it'll play sort of arpeggiated chords.
I love it.
So you can change chord. So those things are quite nice. You can vary the tempo and vary the chords, and that's
very moving, really.
Yeah, that's a good one. I've used that pattern quite a few times.
So look, we've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna save a really sweet compliment for the end. But before this, I'm going to say there's 2 questions you can get through. One is serious. This is a serious one from Chris, which are there ways in which a background in comedy can help you write about a difficult, serious subject like bereavement? Hello. Do you think because there's a rhythm, there's a truthfulness in comedy, and there's a rhythm in comedy, isn't there, that can sometimes help?
Yeah, I think in comedy you're always trying to get as close as you can to some sort of truth that people can relate to, because obviously for a joke to land, you have to get the audience to kind of make a leap with you, and the way that they are able to make that leap is if they can see something they can relate to on the other side of the chasm. I'm kind of bastardizing a something I heard Jerry Seinfeld say about getting the audience to leap across a chasm with you. But yeah, it's something, you're trying to access something universal that people can relate to. And so if it's fake, then people can smell it, I think, and they don't laugh. And I find that's really hard to bear yourself to that degree, to expose yourself to that degree on stage. So I'm not very good at it live, but actually being on your own and writing, it's sometimes easier to access. Sometimes, not always. As soon as you start thinking about how people are going to respond to it, then it becomes very hard.
Really done for. Okay, there's another question, and this is about Rosie. We love Rosie. How has podcast dog Rosie been coping with the lockdown? Please use Rosie's voice. That's me asking that. Constance asks the question.
Well, this is not what Rosie looks like. This is a bulldog, but Rosie has been getting on very well. The lockdown. She's terrorizing the rabbit community. She's discovered a huge rabbit hotel, and she's been trying to kill all the residents of the rabbit hotel one by one. But luckily for the rabbits, she's not fast enough. So very seldom does she ever actually catch one. But I think she's been having a good time. Obviously, claps for the NHS every Thursday along with the rest of us. And luckily, I don't think she can catch COVID. So she's not worried about that aspect of it. But no, she's dealing with it all right. And she's been a great source of comfort to us and to me on days when we're feeling sad and mad. There's nothing like a sympathetic dog friend to make it more bearable.
You at all times. They do love you at all times. Okay, so look, I'm going to wind up now because I can see there's a ticker. Can you see the ticker? And it's going down. But I just wanted to read this to you, and it's from Joe Keeley. And it says, it's not a question. I was just moaning about people not asking questions before. But anyway, this is a nice thing. It says, just to say, I've always enjoyed Adam's work, and he's brought lots of happiness to many people. He's thoughtful, insightful, and funny, and I hope he remains relevant for many years to come. So that's a nice thing for you, Adam, because you are a nice person and we love you and we enjoy your podcast.
Hey, thanks so much.
That's all right. It's an absolute pleasure. It's exactly like you say. It's like we have a nice chat with lots of people here. We can't quite see, but it's very nice of you all to be here.
Thank you.
I'm going to, thank you to everybody who came along. I'd also like to recommend there's other Guardian Live chats coming up. There's one with George the Poet, who makes the most amazing podcast. Oh, fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. So I thoroughly recommend that. I would
he's
also
an amazing
recommend
amazing guy.
Oh, he's fantastic. I would also recommend Adam's audio book. It's really good for when you're walking the dog, I can say. I have listened to it while I've been walking the dog. And obviously, Adam's fantastic podcast will return. And I would like to say, it's really nice to see you, Adam, in your
it's lovely to see you, Miranda.
environment.
Thank you very much for doing this. I appreciate it.
And thank you to everybody for coming along to our weird Zoom event, well, non-Zoom, Guardian event. I think we say bye, don't we? Should we say bye?
Yes. Take care, love you, bye!
Bye, everybody! Bye!